In this video, we will be populating the table with data from the database, which we have already learned how to do. We will also be populating this drop-down list from the database and using the values in that drop-down list to query the database in order to see the data from that new query. Because my goal is to show you the necessary parts, this is not a very nicely laid out web page. I only have the basic components needed. In most cases, the web page would already be developed and you would be adding the necessary components. I would like to stress that you first develop the HTML layout, then you use that code in your PHP echo statements and loops. You always want to verify that you are correctly generating the HTML and the values from the database by looking at the view source code so that you can see how that data is being populated inside the HTML. So when I make a selection from the drop-down list, and then I click the button Display Cities, I have populated the table based on the country code that I have selected. Notice that I have a lot of echo statements at the top of my document that are purely for my own knowledge, so I can test that my results are indeed accurate. If I were to make another selection and click Display Cities, now I have the country codes and the cities where the country code is USA. Notice there are a lot of them. And notice that I do have my row count number up here for my table. Let's go over the SQL and PHP code. We first create our connection, which we have already learned to do. And now we will need two SQL statements. The first SQL statement will populate the table when the page loads. Notice that I have a limit on this table. That is because there are a lot of records in this table, and I am just using it to demonstrate the concepts. Now I am creating the second SQL statement to populate my drop-down list. The drop-down list will be populated with the country codes. So in my SQL statement, I will have select distinct country code from city. So when the page loads, we will be populating the main table and also the drop-down list based on these two SQL statements. The second SQL statement that populates the drop-down list will always be there. That's not going to change. The first SQL statement will change based on the value that the user selects in the drop-down list. So let's look at this form again, and let's logically understand what we're doing. What we're doing is we are making a selection, and then we are clicking the button. This is input type equals submit. This is calling the action of the form. The action of the form is the current page we are on. That is referred to as a postback. So we are posting this information back to itself only when we click the submit button. Therefore, we will use the $_server request method variable to determine when the form was posted back or when the form was submitted. So the code that will make up the new SQL statement, which will have the country code as a parameter in the where clause, will be executed only if this if condition returns true. So when the page loads, that if condition is not true, so none of this code will be read. So let's go back to the form again. Now, supposing the user doesn't make a selection and they click the submit button. We want to give them a message. We want to tell them to please make a selection because we don't want to process this unless there's a country code being sent. Inside the code to be executed, if we are indeed submitting the form, we are storing the value that the form is sending from the one form element, the drop-down list, or the select element. We're storing it in a variable here. Now we have an if condition. If the country code is none, which is the first selection, then we're going to execute this statement. We're storing please make a selection in a variable $MSG. So where is that variable? That variable is right here at the top of our page. However, when the page loads, PHP will read this. So whenever you have variables inside your body, they need to be initialized in the event that they have no value until your code executes later on. So here we are initializing this value to an empty string. Again, variables used in the body should always be initialized. So inside our first if, which determines whether or not the form was submitted, we have another if. The first part of that if checks to see if they made a valid selection. If they did, then the code inside this else block will be executed. This is the code where we're writing the second SQL statement for the table. That will be used to populate the main table. Remember, we already have the value of the country code stored in this variable here. So let's take a look at our SQL statement. Number one, we're using the same $SQL variable as we initially did to populate the table when the page loaded. So we're just going to overwrite the value. Here we have our select, which we had initially. The only difference is now we have a where clause being added. And we are passing it the parameter. And we also have an order by, as we did earlier. We will be passing this value for the parameter using what is called a prepared statement, using the prepare method and the execute method. There are two ways of doing this. We could use the question mark to represent the value being passed for the country code, and in the execute statement, we can pass the value from the variable. Or we can use a colon and then an identifier, which is a little more meaningful than the question mark, to represent the placeholder for the value of that country code. And then in the execute statement, we will have that same placeholder colon variable, and we will have the value that we want to use being stored in it. These values will be coming from the variable that the form value was stored in. So here I will use $CC to represent the country code. So I have my prepare method here where I am preparing this SQL, and now I will execute it by substituting the value which will be stored in the $country code variable as the value for the placeholder, $CC. Notice that both of these are inside quotations. There are other ways of passing values to a SQL query. This is the one that I am using in this example. Now I am in the body section, and I will be generating the HTML and the PHP in the body. So first I am going to populate this form, and I begin by coding in the HTML. The action is the current page. So I will use $_server PHP self. Notice I am concatenating the HTML with the PHP. I am also adding my carriage returns at the end so that my view source lines up vertically, not horizontally. Here is the label element. This is pure HTML. Here is my first select. This is pure HTML. Here is my first option. This is pure HTML. Again, you develop the HTML first so you know that you have it correct. You test it, you validate it, then you bring it in to your PHP code, not the other way around. We'll be using the fetch all statement here. And now we have our for each loop. So we will loop through the records being returned, and we are concatenating the option element here. So we need to concatenate the value inside the HTML tag and also the word that sits in between the opening and closing option tag. So if you look at the source code, the action was generated by PHP. This was essentially hard-coded. And here is the option that is coming from the for each loop. Notice the code came from the database. It is placed as the value. The code also came from the database and it is placed between the opening and closing option elements. Ultimately, we need to end our select. We need to put a submit button there. And we need to end this form. So here we are ending the select. We are coding in the submit button, which is pure HTML. We are ending our form, which is pure HTML. Now, it's always a good idea to have an else in case something happens. Supposing there's an error or there were no results. So here's our echo, just a plain echo. Sorry, there were no results. It's always a good idea to comment your opening and closing delimiters because there's a lot of them and you're going to start getting confused. And if you're missing one, nothing's going to work correctly. The next element on the page is the table. Again, we're making sure that we have a row count. Then we're going to start generating the header portion of the table. Again, using fetch all and for each, we're going to generate the TR and the TD elements. The TD elements have the data from the database. We only have 3 columns that we're using here. And then we end everything. We also have an else in case there were no records. Ultimately, we close the connection. So, populating the table, we've already learned how to do. What is new this week is populating the drop-down list and also querying it. So let's go back up to the beginning where we have our 2 SQL statements. Our first SQL statement, which populated the table, we're using $SQL, $statement. $statement is the key variable that will be used inside the body. Our second SQL statement, which populates the drop-down list, we're using $SQL2 and $statement2, which is the key variable that we'll be using further down. So here we're executing the fetch all method on our $statement2 variable or object, and this is for the form. And for the table, we're executing the fetch all method on the $statement variable or object. When we submit the form and our if condition for $_server request method returns true, we are again using $SQL and $statement, so this will be used to populate the table a second time. It will be different from the way that it was populated when the page loaded. So when the page loads, we populate the table. We're only populating 25 rows because there are thousands of records here. We are also populating the drop-down list, and actually there's 232 rows here. When we make a selection, we are submitting the form, we are executing a new SQL statement, and we will repopulate the table. When we do it again, we are sending a new value for the where clause for the country code. So when we click Display Cities, we see a new result in the table. So here's a question. If we're selecting the country code, for example, USA, and we know that all of the cities are going to be in USA, do we need to show the country code column? Actually, we don't. How do we get around that? Well, it involves writing a little bit extra code, and that is shown in version 2 of this file in the sample code. How we actually do that is we actually are coding in more table code inside the body, but we are using our if condition to detect whether or not the form has been submitted or not. Now, our form will always be populated when the page loads or when the page is resubmitted. We always want the form data there. It's the data in the main table that's going to change. So here I have added if server_request method is not equal to post. So if we have not posted the form, then we are going to be outputting our basic table. And notice here we have the country code. I have also added the if server_request method. And now I have a different table. It's almost the same, except that I have deleted the country code column. But what is determining it is whether or not we have posted that form. So this is the version 2, and notice the page has loaded. Here is my table. Here is my drop-down. Now, if I make a selection and I click Display City, notice I only have 2 columns. I don't have the country code. If you wanted to put the country code on the page, you could, saying something to the effect that cities displayed for this country code are below. There's a lot of things you can do because you already have that variable with the value. Supposing we wanted to go back to the original table, how would we do that? Okay, the answer is on version 3 of this file. What I have done is I have added a button. Technically, this isn't even a button. This is an A element, and it's styled to look like a button. Let's make a selection. There we go. Now, if I want to go back to the original, as I said earlier, this is just the ahref element, but what I am doing, the value of href is this file. You're essentially reloading the page, and when you reload the page, the form has not been yet submitted, so you see the original table. So here is the generated HTML that is actually doing that. As you can see, the value of href is the current page, so I'm essentially just loading the page again. And here is the echo statement that is putting that on the page. Again, you want to write the HTML code first and then convert it into PHP. Now we will add the name of the country code from the query and the number of rows returned. We could also do this for the main table. It would be done the same way. So when the page loads, the main table with all of the cities, country code, and population are displayed. We have a limit of 25 because there are thousands of records in this table. When I make a selection and then I click Display Cities, now I see that there are 4 cities. Not only do I see that there are 4 cities, it tells me. and it also tells me the country code. Remember earlier we eliminated the country code column from the table because it really wasn't necessary because all of the cities would have the same country code. However, the user might want to see what the country code is because they might forget what they select. We already have the variables for these two values, so it is very easy to do this. All I am doing is I am now using a caption element for this specific table. So here you see the source code, and there is the caption element for the table. These variables are already being used in the code, but now because we will be displaying them in the body, we will initialize them to an empty string so that when the page loads, there will not be the chance of an error message. Remember that the table is created when the form is submitted. So we create this table code if this condition $server_request method returns true. So here we are using the echo statements to lay out the table, and within the quotations we have two variables. One variable will retrieve the row count, the other variable will retrieve the country code. These two variables were used at the top of the page when we created the SQL statement. So if I change my selection, now I see that there are 5 cities for the country code GEO. And now I see that there is 1 city for the country code NAM according to the city table in the world database.